darkness fades into new beginnings as we lift our eyes.
I do sometimes lie up here. I'm not proud of it. But sometimes we all have to lie. Like, even when I tell my children not to lie, I'm kind of lying to them. Some people are like, you should never lie to a child. And those people don't have kids. Because when you have kids, you lie to them all the time. You're like, you wouldn't like this ice cream. It's very spicy. I'd share, but Santa said I can't. I'm not encouraging lying. I'm just saying there are times when you need to, right? Like if you're late to meet someone and you see that they're already angry and you don't have an excuse, you have to lie. Because if you told that person the truth, they would never speak to you again. You're gonna be like, hey, I gotta come clean. I just couldn't motivate to get going. I mean, eventually I could. What I'm trying to say is I don't value your time.
Hey everyone, and thanks for joining us for the Ridge Community Church Online. My name is John. I'm one of the pastors on staff at the Ridge. That video that we just watched was from Jim Gaffigan, and I think he's pretty hilarious, even if I don't know if I can fully stand behind his stance on lying. But he does make a really interesting point. Sometimes we might not share everything when we're talking to someone because it's not always the best to be completely blunt in a situation. But where's that line? Well, that's something that our teaching pastor today, Tyler, is going to share more on as we continue our series called Against the Grain. During this series, we're sharing some things that you can put into practice to really experience your best life. And these are things that are a little bit different than what other people might do, but our lives will be better because of it. Now, it's not just this series where we're trying to help your life, but it's really all the time. It's answering faith questions that you have, helping you find people that help you grow, giving you resources to apply the things you learn, and more. And these are the things that you're going to experience when you get connected with the Ridge. So I want to invite you, just text the number that you see on the screen, and it'll help you continue your faith journey on all sorts of different things throughout the week. Now, before I send it over to Tyler, I want to let you know that we're going to be taking communion today. So if you have the chance and you feel comfortable, grab some of the elements, some bread, some juice, and join us as Tyler's going to share week 3 of Against the Grain.
Well, and welcome everyone joining us in Oak Creek, Franklin, and everyone online, and to everyone in Greenfield. It's great to be with you today. If we haven't met, my name is Tyler. I serve as one of our pastors here at the Ridge. And to start off our time together today, I actually went and read an article online, and it's actually asking these kids these questions about, hey, what is God like? And that's a hard question to answer, you know, like for us, and definitely for kids to answer, well, hey, what is God like? Well, they did their best. They did a great job, and I wanted to call out just a couple examples of what they said. There was this young girl named Lauren. She said, I think God is very loving, but I also imagine he's very tall. Okay, yeah, well done. I can see why you said that. And in a similar vein, there was another young boy named Kalen, and he said, he's got to have big hands because that song says he's got the whole world in it. It's like, well done, well done. Well, there's another boy named Justin, and Justin went deep on us, and he did really well. Here's what Justin said. He said, yes, God is loving, but he's also a sin hater. Who's the nicest man in the world, and I think he has a beard. Like, okay, all right, you know, that might work out, but, you know, that's a tough question for answering. Like, how do you know what God is like? Well, today we're actually going to learn just what God is like by someone who was asked that question, and he actually spent time with God, and we'll see what that looks like for us as we are in part 3 of a series today called Against the Grain. And what we're doing is we're actually letting this question that many of us have asked, in fact, 12 billion searches on Google have asked this question, question, and it's just driving this series because we're so interested in this question. And the question is, well, how do we live our best life now? And Google has come up with the top 5 answers, and we hear from many people in our culture, their answers to the question, and it falls in line with basically, hey, do whatever you can do to make yourself happy. And there's nothing wrong with the desire to be happy. There's nothing wrong with being happy because happiness is actually a good thing. The challenge is when it becomes our focus, because what it leads to is we live our best life now by focusing on our pleasure. And we wouldn't necessarily say our pleasure. We'd say things like, hey, just follow your heart, and the heart wants what the heart wants, and just go ahead and follow and live for those desires, and that will help you live your best life now. Now, what we've been seeing throughout this series is that leads to some challenges because it promises something that it can't deliver. It's not our best life now because when we live for our pleasure, we're living for our life, and it's just limited to our life. We feel more empty, unfulfilled, and like we're missing out on our purpose. And so what we're doing throughout this series is we're looking at a different answer, a better answer to the question, how do you live your best life now? And this answer to the question actually came from one of Jesus's closest followers. His name is John, and this is a passage that is just driving this series. And here's what John said about Jesus. He said, in him was life. And him being Jesus, the author and the essence of life. He says, when you find life in Jesus, you find that he will meet the deepest longings of your soul. And here's what it means to have life in Jesus. What it means is that what is true of Jesus actually ends up becoming true of us. And so we see Jesus' power, his freedom, his victories, his life. We realize that we can experience that for ourselves as well. And so what we're doing on this series is we're going on this journey up until Easter to find how we can find and have this life in Jesus. And this is where we bump into some challenges, because whether you're a follower of Jesus or not, you will see that life in Jesus actually goes against the grain of a culture that says, hey, just focus on living for your pleasure to have your best life. But we think it's worth to be up for the challenge, because what we'll see is that we can really find this deep, this rich, this meaningful life in Jesus. And so if you missed any of those previous weeks, I really want to encourage you to go onto YouTube or go onto our podcast, and you can catch up with those previous weeks. And then while you're at it, share it with a friend who's looking for how to live their best life now, because that will help them find life in Jesus as well. But here's where we're going to go today. Today, we're going to look at another against the grain idea that actually just really, really goes against the grain of culture. But when we understand this leads us to really beginning to receive the life and find the life that we have in Jesus. And it's all based around that question that we had those kids ask a little bit earlier. Well, what is God really like? Because if we go back to John, just a few verses later, after he said, in Jesus' life, John actually uses some words to describe Jesus, which means he's describing God because Jesus was God personified. And like the kids, John could say anything. He could have used any words, he could use any phrases to describe what he's like, but he actually spent time and he interacted with Jesus. He saw him face to face, he talked with him, and he decided, hey, here are the best words that I can use to describe Jesus, and ultimately, I'm describing God. And here's what John said, just a few verses later after in Jesus' life. He said, we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father. This is Jesus, and he's full of grace and truth. Hey, John, what is Jesus like? What words would you use? These are the words. This is the phrase, and this is how John goes against the grain. He says he's full of grace and full of truth. And they would have heard this back then. They go, oh, hold on. No, John. I mean, that can't be God. I mean, you would mean full of justice and truth, and full of rules and truth, and full of guilt and truth, because that's how they viewed God back then. But John's like, nope, I've interacted with him. I've seen him. I talked with him. He is full of both grace and truth. And this is another way of how Jesus went against the grain. Now, when it comes to truth for us, we look at our culture, truth has become this complex idea. Because we talk about truth and we have phrases that say, well, hey, I have my truth and you have your truth. I'll speak my truth, you speak your truth. And we come up with phrases of like, I'm just going to tell it like it is, and I'm going to call it how I see it. I'm going to keep it real. And we view our truth based on our experiences, our perceptions, and our reality. And some of us, we've had truth done to us like this. We've had people use truth as a weapon on us, where they would say, hey, I'm going to tell it like it is, and I'm just going to call it like I see it, and then they've told us something, and they were a jerk about it. And it just kind of left just hurting our feelings, but they're just like, I'm just keeping it real. You know, others of us, we've experienced truth weaponized against us like this, where maybe we didn't fall in line with another person's view of their truth, and they wanted to make sure that we knew about it. So they actually said, you know what, I'm going to distance myself from you, and I'm going to keep others, you know, from distancing themselves from you. And so they're going to end up canceling you, and it's that cancel culture because of truth. And we're just wondering, what do we do with all of these different views of truth? But the definition of truth, if you actually go into a dictionary, the definition that comes is that truth is consistent with reality. So when we say the phrase, I'm keeping it real, it's actually in line with the definition of what a truth is. It's just consistent with reality. Now, the challenge for many of us would be, well, based on whose reality, because we all have these different views of truth. And so we'd be talking about my truth and your truth and tell your truth. And if John were with us, talking with us today, he would actually hear that conversation and say, I don't get it. That's impossible, because there is one truth. And I have seen that truth. And it is Jesus. And it's Jesus' truth. Jesus is consistent with reality because Jesus is the truth. In fact, Jesus even said later, I am the truth. And so Jesus is truth personified. Now, we might push back against that and say, oh, well, that sounds like an absolute statement. That's an absolute truth. And, you know, you can't have absolute truth. You don't know absolute truth. And that's actually an absolute statement in of itself. I mean, we all naturally gravitate towards absolute statements, and that's okay, because truth is consistent with reality. And that's how John is defining what truth is. That truth is Jesus, because Jesus is truth personified. And so John describes Jesus as being full of truth, but not just full of truth. He really went against the grain by introducing another idea and saying that Jesus is also full of grace. And this went against the grain of their culture back then, and it goes against the grain of our culture now, because they did not view this as just, they viewed God as just truth and just being full of truth. But here's the beautiful thing about grace, is that when we begin to experience grace, it's life-changing and life-giving. In fact, it is so powerful and yet so mysterious. Here's what grace is. Grace is getting something you don't deserve. And John says Jesus came and he was full of both grace and truth. And so let's compare the two side by side, what grace and truth are. They say these different things. Truth says, hey, there are consequences that you and I will experience. Grace says, you're forgiven. Truth says, you're broken beyond repair. But grace says, you're restored. Truth says, here's what's expected. And grace says, you know what? I love you no matter what. And it's important to recognize these two, because here's what's true of all of us. All of us are going to naturally lean towards one or the other, personally speaking. And most couples that you meet, there's generally one person in the relationship that's going to lean one way, and another person in the relationship that's going to lean the other way. In my marriage, for example, I'm the one that generally leans more truth. I grew up in a household of just truth tellers. I mean, my family and I, we were just straight shooters. We told it how it was. We just called it as it is. And that was just our experience just growing up. And so I naturally leaned more truth and say, here's the truth and here are the consequences. My wife, on the other hand, she grew up in a home that was a lot more gracious towards one another. The family just constantly just demonstrated grace towards one another. When I first met my wife, started dating her, and met her family, I was just blown away at how gracious they were towards one another. And they just kept their relationships going because of how gracious that they were. And so that's how we operate in our home. I lean more truth, and she leans more grace. Now, it's important for us to recognize which way we lean naturally, because here's what's true of all of us. the way that we actually lean towards grace or truth actually begins to impact how we view God. And the way that we view God actually determines how we respond to God and how we respond to others. And so if you're like me and you naturally lean more truth, you're going to have that impact your view of God, and it's going to impact how you respond to God and respond to others through the lens of truth. You, for example, might see God more through the lens of through rules and maybe rituals and consequences, and say, here's what I have to do. I heard someone the other day call God the Punisher and say, because they're basically like, oh, here's the rules that I did not follow through, and I'm going to get punished as a result of this. And that's how we begin to view God and how we treat God and treat others. And here's how it can play out. The other day, I was on Twitter, and I was just scrolling through Twitter, and I saw actually a part of a message from a pastor that I follow starting to trend on Twitter. And I saw this minute-long part of this message, and I realized, I'm like, this message was given 5 years ago. A long time ago, and it was a minute, which was a part of a story, and the pastor didn't tweet about it. These truth tellers were tweeting about it, and they were starting to talk about this message and the pastor in that message, and they started saying how wrong he was, and that if you follow him, how wrong you are, and that he shouldn't be followed and he shouldn't be listened to because that isn't the truth. And if you naturally lean more truth, that's what happens. It's either right or wrong. And that's what happens when we lean more truth. Now, if you lean more grace, what we can do is we can view God as God being all about mercy, all about grace, all about forgiveness, and God's just going to always be there just to let it go and to give us what we don't deserve and to just forgive us. And when we live in a way that clearly contradicts something that's commanded in Scripture, we would say, hey, it doesn't really matter what I believe or how I behave because God's good with it. God just wants me to be happy. And so when we lean that way, that's how we can view God and respond that way. But what we see, what John's telling us, he says, hey, no, Jesus wasn't either or. It's not grace or truth. Jesus was both and. He was filled to the brim and overflowing with both. And in fact, John really wanted to make sure that we were clear about this, that just a few verses later, he repeated himself again. He says, I really want you to understand this, how Jesus went against the grain. And here's what Jesus did. He said, for the law was given through Moses. And the law, this was their culture back then. God was all truth. It was all about rules and laws and consequences. And he said, Jesus went against the grain by introducing this. Grace and truth came, literally, was born through Jesus. Jesus didn't come to balance between grace and truth. No, he was full of both. He was the embodiment of both. He's both and because he is full of both grace and truth. That's exactly what Jesus is like. And so, when you read about the life of Jesus, you see him just going against the grain of culture again and again and again, just demonstrating and showing his grace and truth in every interaction that he met with the different people. And we see this happen over and over again. In fact, one of the reasons why he invited his followers to follow him was because no one else would invite them to follow him, but he's actually demonstrating grace and truth by inviting them to follow him. And so one of my favorite examples of this is a man that he invited to be a part of his inner circle named Matthew. And Matthew was a tax collector back then, and people just hated tax collectors, not because they were employees of the IRS. That wasn't why. But back then, they would actually view tax collectors as the worst of the worst in their society. Because tax collectors were actually taking money from their people, the ancient Israelites, and they were giving it over to the Roman government who was oppressing them. And so they viewed these tax collectors as these traitors that were just turning on their people. And then it was also widely known that these tax collectors would just charge them just a little bit more than what they actually owed, and they would just pocket the difference. So they were stealing from them, and they knew that they were these thieves who were taking this money from them. So they were hated in their culture. In fact, culture said, here's what we do with tax collectors. We just push them to the side. We don't even interact with them. We cancel them because they are worse than sinners. And so Jesus, he goes against the grain. He sees Matthew sitting at this tax collector's booth, and Jesus invites him to follow him. And what's amazing about Matthew is he actually gets up and he follows him. And he begins to say, okay, I want to be a part of your inner circle. And then Jesus actually invites himself over to Matthew's house where they spend some more time together. And this is how Matthew actually describes this interaction. Matthew is describing this himself in the third person. He said, while Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came, and they ate with him and his disciples. And if we invited someone over to our house today to have a dinner, I mean, that's a big deal. That's seen as, hey, I'm just welcoming this person in my home. But back then, this was seen as an even bigger deal. By way of saying, hey, we're going to have someone over for dinner, and we're going to eat together. That's the way of saying, hey, we're boys. Like, we're in the inner circle. We associate with each other. Like we are tight-knit, and we're hanging out together. And what's so fascinating to see and what's so important to see is that Jesus, he spent time hanging out with people who were nothing like him, and he liked them. And they liked him back. And so he's spending time with these tax collectors and these sinners. And these religious leaders who were nearby, these Pharisees, these truth tellers, they didn't know what to do about this, so they went into truth-only mode. And here's what we read about what they said. They said, they asked the disciples, hey, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? And they're going into their truth, because here's what they knew. They realized these were tax collectors and these are sinners, and because they are religious leaders and men of God, that they should actually follow their customs and just push these people to the side and have nothing to do with them. And so they're saying to Jesus' disciples, if Jesus was this religious leader that you think he is, he would know who these guys are and he would push them to the side. But since he's not pushing them to the side, he must not be that religious leader that we think he is, and so he must not be the man of God that you think he is. Why are you following him? And so they're just trying to insert their truth on Jesus, and Jesus, he hears this, and he responds to them, and see how he responds. I mean, he just demonstrates both grace and truth in this response, where he says, hey, hey guys, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. And I think this is one of the most interesting things and most big differences to note between Matthew and the Pharisees. Because Matthew, he's been spending his life living for his pleasure. He's stolen from other people. He's made a lot of money, and he's gained the pleasure. But yet, we realize that there's still something missing in his life. He's feeling empty and unfulfilled. We know that because Jesus invited him to follow him, and he followed him. And maybe he's wondering, hey, I don't know much about him, but maybe perhaps this man Jesus has something that I'm looking for. He knew something was off in his life. But yet the Pharisees, they looked at their lives and they're like, hey, we're good with God. We don't need Jesus. We don't need him in our life. We're just fine without him. And so Jesus, he begins to describe how and show how he's full of both grace and truth here. Where he says, here's the truth. Matthew's sick. He's missing out on something. He knows he's sick. I know he's sick. But here's the grace. I'm going to give him what he doesn't deserve. And I'm going to give him healing. I'm going to restore him because that's what I've come here to do. And then Jesus really wanted to drill this in for the religious leaders. He wanted to make sure that they got this, that he emphasized this with this next statement. He said, hey guys, go and learn. And what I love about Jesus here, he's just jabbing at these religious leaders. He's making fun of them because all they do is spend their days just learning and memorizing different parts of the scripture. And so he's just telling them, hey, go and learn this because you haven't learned it yet before. And then he quotes from the prophet Hosea. They probably have this memorized, where Jesus said, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And then he states this again. Notice the grace and truth here. He says, for I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. And the truth is, I know that there are people who have distanced themselves from God, and they know that they have distanced themselves from God, and I have come here to give them what they don't deserve. I've come to call and invite them to follow me. And Jesus just did this again and again and again. He went against the grain by being full and demonstrating both grace and truth. And this is where it starts getting personal for us, because this is going to go against the grain for us in our culture today. And it's going to go against the grain in a number of different ways. For some of us who tend to lean towards grace and tend to just view God as a God of grace, here's how this is going to go against the grain for us. We struggle with truth, because when we hear the idea of truth, we're like, ooh, that means like there's rules and God is inviting me to do something and to change things and there's consequences, and it just feels absolute, and I don't know what to do about it, because it just feels so hard and almost like anti-grace. What do I do with the truth? And here's why I want to encourage you to go against the grain and also see God as the God of truth. See, Jesus, he loves you so much that he wants you to understand the truth, because here's what's true about sin when we go our way rather than God's way. Sin has a gotcha. And Jesus loves you too much to not let sin get you. He knows that when we do things our own way for our own pleasure, it can bring damage into our lives. And that's why he says things like, hey, I want you to be honest, and I want you to be truthful, and don't lie. Don't lie to those around you, because when you lie, here's what it does. It erodes trust in that relationship. And what Jesus wants for us, he wants what's best for us. He wants us to have healthy relationships. So he says, this is why I want you to be truthful. This is why Jesus said, hey, I want you to forgive as I've forgiven you. That's the truth. And he knew this, because if we don't forgive, here's what happens. We carry bitterness with us, not just into that one relationship, into every relationship that we go. And it just begins to break down these relationships. And again, Jesus wants us to have these best relationships. And so he says, this is why I want you to have truth, because I want what's best for you. And so if you naturally lean more grace, here's what I want you to understand about truth, is that truth, it's not here to condemn us. Truth is what transforms us. Because Jesus wants us to experience the best life that he has in him. He wants us to experience this full life. And a full life in him ultimately takes us to a place where we become someone who loves, looks, and lives like Jesus. And in order to reach that, we have to understand the truth. When he tells us the truth, he says, hey, here's where you are, and here's where I want you to be. And I say this not to condemn you. I'm just saying this to invite you to take your next step, to experience this transformation in your life, so that you can become someone who looks more like me. And so, we want to see God as the God of grace and truth. Now, others of us who tend to lean more truth, and we struggle with this idea of grace, here's why we need to see more grace in our life. You know, we struggle with the idea of grace because we're like, oh, you know, does this mean no boundaries? Does this mean like there's no limits? You know, it's a free-for-all and anyone can do whatever they want? No. The reason why we want more to see God as a God of grace is because of the truth that all of us have sinned. And all of us have gone our own way rather than God's way. We all deserve the consequences that come with it. But with grace, God tells us this: I still got you, even though sin got you. And I'm still here to give you what you don't deserve. I was in our lobby a couple weeks ago, and I was meeting with some people, and there was this one guy who came up to me and said he's been new to the Ridge, and he shared this statement with me that I've heard others say before, but I mean, this is so personal to anyone who ever says it. And he just said this. He said, you know, I walked through the doors, and I was surprised the walls didn't come down on me when I came in. You know, because, man, if I could just tell you about what I've done in the past and what I've experienced, man, and he's like, if I just, you know, took 5 minutes and began to explain all of this to you, I don't even know if I'd be welcome here. And for many of us, this is our view of God. We see God as this God of truth, and we see what's been happening in our past, and we feel this guilt, and we feel this condemnation, and we aren't sure if we're still welcome here, and we aren't sure if God is welcoming us or is wanting to invite us to follow him. And this is what's so powerful about grace. And this is why Jesus went against the grain to give grace. Because it's grace is what ultimately connects us with God. Because Jesus says, yes, I came with truth. And the truth is, I don't want you to walk in sin. I don't want sin to get you. But here's what grace is. Grace is, I'm going to love you no matter what. My invitation to you to follow me is always open. Even if you step away and you say, hey, no thanks, my invitation is right there to you. Come follow me. Whenever you receive this gift of grace, I'm here because this gift of grace is always available to you. That's what Jesus wants for you. In fact, that's why Jesus came to give his life so that we could receive this life in him. Grace is what connects us with God. And so we want to see God as the God of grace and truth, because that's exactly what he is like. And what we learn from this is when we receive grace and truth from God, we see God in a whole new way. But even more than that, we go against the grain as followers of Jesus by doing the same thing to those around us. See, what Jesus invites us to do is to become someone who looks like him, and so we demonstrate grace and truth in every interaction with every single person that we meet. Now, this is hard. Jesus is actually raising the bar on us to go against the grain to do this, because to live in grace and truth, it becomes very, very difficult to do. But what we realize when we do this, when we start with receiving grace and truth from God and then demonstrating this to others, we are at our best. We are living our best life in Jesus when we demonstrate grace and truth to others, even though it goes against the grain of culture. There's a couple that I've gotten to know over the last couple of years here at the Ridge, and they've been attending here, and they've been following Jesus for some time, but they reached a point in their marriage where they really needed to learn how to demonstrate grace and truth to the other. There was one lady, the lady in the relationship, she revealed to the husband and said, hey, I spent over $100,000 in credit card debt that you didn't know about. And we reached a point where I can't hide it anymore. I don't know what to do with this. And the husband understandably felt betrayed by this. And he's like, I don't know what to do with this. And most couples honestly would throw in the towel at that point and just call it quits. But they saw this as a moment and said, hey, our relationship has hit a point that we need to respond in a really, really significant way to get through this. And they committed to each other. They said, okay, we know what Jesus is like, full of grace and truth. We need to be full of grace and truth through all of this as well. And so they started by acknowledging the truth. The truth was they owe a lot of money and their relationship is in crisis. And they realized they needed to do some work and put together a plan to get through this. And so they started working together on a plan. They said, okay, we're going to get individual counseling. We're going to get couples counseling. We're going to come up with a plan to pay off this debt. We're going to go through Financial Peace University. We're going to take these steps to just come up with a plan to dig in deep and to sacrifice and to get out of debt. But they also had to acknowledge grace and say, we need to give each other things that we don't deserve in order for this to work. And so they committed to one another. They said, we're not going to blame each other. And we're not going to we're not going to say, hey, this is your fault, because we both have had contributed to this problem. And we're going to commit to being in this relationship no matter what. And we're going to commit to just receiving this grace from God through this whole process. And so that started about 2 years ago. And they worked for the 2 years by working that plan to get out of debt, to go into counseling, to spend that time and to find healing and to bring health into their relationship. And they would describe those 2 years as some of the 2 hardest years of their life. They said it was just hard making those cuts, making those sacrifices, and to work through it. But 2 years later, just a few months ago, they paid it off. And they finished it off. They said, hey, we got out of this. We're debt-free. And they would say, even more than that, what's better than that? Our marriage and our relationship is in a much better spot. We feel so close to God, and we feel so close to each other because we went and we demonstrated to each other what it's like to be full of grace and truth. And that's the power and yet the complexity of grace and truth. And Jesus, that's what he was. He was grace and truth personified. That is exactly what God is like. And that's what he calls us to be like, to go against the grain and to demonstrate grace and truth to everyone and to every circumstance. And so here's how we get started with this. I just want you to wrestle with this question to get started. And that is there a situation where you are mostly truth, but it needs some grace? Or vice versa? Let's commit to going against the grain and do it. And here's what this would look like. For those of us who lean mostly grace, let's go against the grain and identify the truth. And here's how you do this. You identify the truth that you are resisting. And you say, I'm going to go against the grain and I'm going to identify the truth, and I'm going to lean into it. And here's what this is going to look like. For some of you, you've been dishonest at work and been dishonoring other employees and coworkers because of the dishonesty, trying to get ahead. And so you're like, you know what? I'm going to lean into the truth that honesty is actually going to lead to health in these relationships, and it helps build trust, although it's going to be painful at first. So you say, you know what? I'm going to honor, and I'm going to tell the truth and honor my coworkers. Others of us, we made the decision to follow Jesus, and we know that the truth is that he's calling us to go public with that decision by being baptized. And that's just a commandment he asks us to do, and we've been resistant to it. We're like, okay, I know that's the truth, but and so we're going to lean into it. We're going to sign up to get baptized the next opportunity that there are for baptisms. We're just going to identify the truth that we know Jesus is calling us to do, and we're going to lean into it, and we are going to demonstrate both grace and truth. And then others of us, if you're like me, and you lean mostly truth, here's how this is going to look for you. You're going to give grace to someone who doesn't deserve it. And you're going to be full of grace as well as you're full of truth. And here's how that can look like. You have that person in your life that has done that wrong to you, and they've never apologized. You're going to forgive them. And you're going to forgive them because that's what Jesus has done for you. Others of you, you're going to go to the restaurant, and that waiter, they're going to screw up your bill. I mean, they're just going to mess it up and bring out the wrong food. And here's what you're going to do. You're going to be kind to them anyways. You're going to tip them well, because that's what we do when we are full of grace and we're demonstrating grace and truth, like Jesus has done that for us. Others of us, we're going to go on social media, and we're going to refuse to accuse and gossip and leave that negative comment. We're going to refuse to do it. Instead, here's what we're going to do. We're going to comment something encouraging and positive. And we're just going to say, hey, you know what? I normally would talk trash about that person, but I'm going to say something good about them, because that's what living in grace and truth is going to do. Because what is Jesus like? He is full of both. He embodied both grace and truth. And he went against the grain when he did that. And we go against the grain of our culture when we do that. But even more than that, when we do that, we find the best life in him, because it is so good. It is so life-giving to be full of both grace and truth. And so to wrap up our time together, we're going to take part in an act that just reminds us and helps us reflect on how Jesus was full of both grace and truth. And what we're going to do together at all of our locations is we're going to participate in communion together. And communion is just a great symbol of how Jesus was both full of grace and truth, because the truth is we've all sinned against God. And we've all gone our own way rather than God's way. And the truth is that our sins, it needed to be paid for. But here's the grace of Jesus. He actually went and he paid for it by dying on the cross for you and for me. And so right now at all of our locations, I'm going to invite us to just go ahead and start passing the communion baskets across the row. And you can grab the items out of those baskets. If you're uncomfortable taking communion, you can actually just let those items just pass you by. If you're joining us online, you were encouraged earlier to grab some bread or crackers or juice. Now's a great time to go ahead and pull those out to participate with all of us together. And at all of our locations, once you grab the items, you'll notice that there's a cracker on the top, which represents the bread, and at the bottom there's some juice, which represents the cup. And that night before Jesus was killed, he actually had a meal with his closest followers. And at that meal, as he was explaining to them what was about to happen before it happened, he did this in a really powerful way. He actually took a loaf of bread and he broke it, and he said, "This is my body, which has been broken for you for the forgiveness of your sins." Because the truth is you've sinned, but the grace is I'm breaking my body for you. And he told them to take and eat and to do so in remembrance of that grace that he's given. And then shortly after that, he took out a cup and he poured it out, and he said, "This is my blood, which has been poured out for you for the forgiveness of your sins," because he's going to give you and I something that we don't deserve, and that is he paid for our sin by shedding his innocent blood. And he told them to take and to drink and to do so in remembrance of him. And so right now, online, all of our locations, I'm going to invite us just take a moment to take of the elements, to spend some time eating of the bread and drinking of the cup, and just taking a moment and silently just thanking God that he is a God that is full of both grace and truth, and that has given you and I the best life in Jesus. So let's take a moment and let's take this together. And so, God, when we just live in a time that we just keep it as it is, we tell the truth, and, you know, we have our views of truth, and we live in a culture and we live in a time that just says, hey, when we live for ourselves, you know, we'll experience the best life. But, God, we know how empty we've been feeling. And, God, we know that has just shown itself just in the anxiety and the burnout and the loneliness that many of us have been feeling. And God, you've just seen us. And God, your love for us is so great that you said, no, that's not the way to live. Let me show you the way to live. And God, you've done just that. That Jesus, when you came, God personified and lived among us to show us exactly what God is like. And even though that's against the grain of culture, and even though it's against the grain of how maybe we would want to live for ourselves, we realize that your way of life is so much better than our life. And so, Jesus, right now, we just trust you. And we want to follow you, even though it goes against the grain, even though it's a struggle and it's a challenge at first. What we realize and what we learn is life in you is so much better than life without. And so, Father, as we just look at this and we see that you are a God that is filled with grace and truth, we're so grateful that those are the right two words to describe you. Because we could have just been left in the truth that we don't measure up. Because, Father, we don't measure up to you. But you've given us the grace. You've given us what we don't deserve. You've given us the ability to have life in you through your Son, Jesus. And we are so grateful for that. And so, God, right now, I just pray, God, that we can demonstrate that to a world that just desperately needs it. To our communities that are just looking for hope. God, that we can share the hope of Jesus by living lives full of grace and truth. God, that we would be at our best, that we would then take the grace and truth you've given us, and we would share that with those around us. So, God, I pray that as we do, we would see relationships restored. God, I pray that we would see communities healed. And, God, we would see just you move throughout our community and throughout the world by drawing people to you, because we're showing others what it's like to be full of grace and truth. And so, Jesus, we thank you for what you've done for us. We thank you for giving us your life so we can receive life in you. And it's in your name we pray. Amen.
In the darkness we were waiting, without hope, without light, till from heaven you came running. There was mercy in your eyes, to fulfill the law and prophets. To a virgin came the word, from the throne of endless glory to a cradle in the dirt. With one voice, let's sing praise the Father. Praise the Father, praise the Son, praise the Spirit, three in one. God of glory, majesty, praise forever to the King of Kings. Hallelujah. To reveal the kingdom coming and to reconcile the lost, to redeem the whole creation. You did not despise the cross, for even in your suffering, you saw to the other side. till that stone was moved for good. For the Lamb had conquered death. Come on. And the dead rose from their tombs, and the angels stood in awe. For the souls of all who come to the Father are restored. Come on, church. And the church of Christ was born. Then the Spirit lit the flame. Now this gospel truth of old shall not kneel, shall not fade. By His blood and in His name, in His freedom I am free. For the love of Jesus Christ, who has resurrected me. Oh, yeah. Praise the Father, praise the Son, praise the Spirit, three in one. God of glory, majesty, praise forever to the King. Come on, let's sing. We pray, oh, praise the Father, praise the Son, praise the Spirit, three in one. God of glory, majesty, praise forever to the King of kings. Sing praise forever to the King of kings. Thank you, Lord.
Whether you're curious about faith or if you're someone who's been following Jesus for years, you're never done taking steps in your faith journey. Being here now shows that you're open to doing that digitally. And everyone's faith journey is a little bit different. But there's still practical things that you can do to grow. And something really practical that you can do to kind of help your faith journey is to head over to our Next Steps page. Now these days, you can click for content just about anywhere. But we both know that not all clicks and content are equal. So allow our Next Steps team to serve you and support your faith journey by curating a few ideas so that you can select a vetted option that you can be confident will help you take your best next step. On this page, you're going to find different sections of questions that you might be wrestling with. That might be if you're not sure about your faith in Jesus, what to do when you start following Him, or how to get closer to God. Under these types of questions, you'll see some things that you can try out as steps that you can take to reach a new stage of your faith journey. And as you watch some of these videos or do some of these exercises, don't feel like you have to do that by yourself. Invite a trusted friend, your significant other, or someone in your Ridge group to go through some of these questions with you, or to watch one of these videos with you. We made this page because we want to help you figure out and take your next step. That's not something that you should have to do on your own, because you're not alone in this. We've got your back. And this is an amazing way to take charge of your faith journey and really experience the benefits that come when we follow Jesus. One step in everyone's faith journey is choosing to honor God in the area of finances. Our hearts are pretty closely tied to our money, and it takes some effort to really release it back to God. But that's why it matters to God. It's really showing that you trust in Him and you trust in what He wants for your life. If you're ready to take this step in your faith journey and your relationship with God, I want to invite you to give. And the easiest way to do that is by following the link that you see on the screen. We're going to take this moment of offering together, and then I'll be right back. Thanks for joining us this week as we really figure out how to live the amazing life that Jesus wants us to live. We're continuing that next week as we dive into the very first thing that we need to focus on in order to make all the things we're talking about possible. So we're going to find out where it all starts next week. Thanks again for being with us, and may the hope of Jesus be in your home as you bring it to the homes of those around you.
I've seen too good to not